The Funj Sultanate was an African kingdom located in modern-day Sennar that existed from 1504 till 1821. The name, Funj, comes from the people that established the kingdom, the Funj, a collection of tribal peoples of unknown ancestry. Located in East Africa, the kingdom held territories in what is now modern-day Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and South Sudan. The kingdom was based around the city of Sennar, the hub of people, politics, and trade. The kingdom effectively halted Mamluk and Ottoman expansion south for hundreds of years, while creating a region where pre-Islamic and pre-Christian African traditions continued to exist after they had disappeared elsewhere. The collapse of the Nubian kingdoms at the end of the 1400s sent the Sudan into crisis. The large amounts of migration from Sudanese tribes north, as well as Arab tribes and Mamluks pushing south, meant that the region was a crowded place. Everyone was out for themselves. Conquest, plunder, and glory was the aim of the game, and the Arabs, specifically the Abdalab tribe, looked like they had a good shot at uniting the whole region. Then came the Funj. The Funj entered the scene in around 1500 out of nowhere, and completely changed the regional power dynamic. The Funj pushed into the region and established a capital along the Blue Nile known as Sennar, and started conquering those around them. The Funj fought the Arabs, and were victorious, making the Abdalab into vassals to guard their northern frontier. There were 28 kings of the Funj, some ruling for decades, others for mere months. So I'll make a separate video for those interested in the fascinating history of the Funj kings. But for now, a quick run through of 300 years of Funj political history. So, Amara Dunkas was an escaped slave who led the Funj, founded Sennar, and was their first king. Amara Dunkas's sons then go on to rule the empire. Along comes Dakin the Just, who instigates a range of administrative reforms. The Abdalab revolt, and Funj kings then become puppets of the Arab tribes. Adlan II then rises up and defeats the Arabs, but he is betrayed by his nephew, Badi II, who then takes the throne. Under Badi II, the empire is at its height. A new dynasty comes to power, the Nol dynasty, and then Badi IV loses a big important war, and he has to rely on the Hamaj tribe for support. The Hamaj become the power behind the throne, and the Funj kings and the Hamaj regents fight for power for, how about 80 years? Power swaps between Funj kings and the Hamaj regents. There are so many puppet kings, most of whom are called Badi for some reason, and the empire is weakened by civil wars and fails to adopt new military technology. This means that in 1821, the Egyptians effectively walk into the Funj capital, say, "Dis mine now," and conquer the Funj without firing a shot. Okay, that was a crash course in Funj political history. Like I said, I would highly recommend that you check out my other video about the Funj kings. It makes Game of Thrones look like a tea party. The role of the king in the Funj Sultanate was different to Islamic and Christian kingdoms, as the Funj drew their inspiration for kingship from older African traditions, such as the Shilluk in Ethiopia or even ancient Egypt. The king was a near divine figure, rarely appearing in public, communicating through courtiers and officials, and engaging in specific ceremonial customs, such as not being able to sit while eating. The Funj didn't really have the same idea of private property as in the West or within Islam. Technically, all land was the property of the Funj kings, and it was run and managed by his vassals. The structure of the Funj Empire was based along feudal lines. The king was the central authority from which all legitimacy was derived, with the king having a series of vassals and governors beneath him. An internal Funj province was governed by a Mak, who commanded a series of local aristocrats and holders of land known as the Majil, who then commanded leaders of villages, the Kursi. Outer non-Funj provinces were often conquered from other kingdoms, and were usually given to the previous rulers to serve as vassals, or Meks. For example, the Abdalab were the Meks of Quarry. All Meks and Maks were required once a year to visit Sennar and pay tribute to the king. The king could create new land titles to give to other groups, and was the only power in the land that could technically condemn a person to death. Each province had a Sid al-Kam, a representative of the king, who was invested with the king's power to act as executioner in the name of the king. Think of the Funj kingdom as being split in two, the internal rule of the Maks and the external rule of the Meks, with the king being the linking factor that brought the state together. Within the Funj Empire, there was an extremely powerful council that helped the Funj kings rule. The council was made of senior family members, court officials, and important vassals, with Muslim holy men taking a more important position as time went on. The council would meet 4 times a week, morning and night, to discuss and solve the issues of the day. Critically, the council had 2 powerful, important roles. The council was able to dethrone the king and also order his death. This is because succession in the Funj Empire was of great concern. So when the king died, the next king was chosen by the council and by powerful lords, meks and maks. All the king's brothers were often executed so as to provide stability. Of course, many brothers would flee the capital and went into exile and then were often recalled to become the next king. When one of the wives of the king, the Funj kings actually had multiple wives, gave birth to a son, she was set aside to prevent her giving birth to a second son that was the full brother of the first. Daughters were often married off to provincial rulers and aristocrats, building dynastic links within the Funj kingdom, with the Funj king's daughters often effectively running the provinces and regions instead of their mek or mak husbands. Now I want to talk about religion and society. The role of religion in the Funj kingdom changed drastically over the years. Amara Dunkas converted to Islam in 1523, and this provided a Muslim facade to the Funj Empire. But, in reality, the Funj were not Muslim, and pre-African traditions were more popular in both the royal court and villages than Islam was. For example, beer and pork were regularly consumed across the empire until the 1700s. The customs of the Funj people also went against Islamic and Christian norms. Funj traditions demanded that women walk bare-chested and men bareheaded. These traditions eventually changed as Islam became more popular and were attacked for being un-Islamic. So understanding this, how did Islam function in the Funj Empire? Sunni Islam became the popular religion of the region in the 1700s. Islam in the Funj was actually more aligned with the Maliki Islamic school of thought. Sennar became a key location for pilgrims travelling from West Africa and Spain to Mecca, and thus took much of the West African Maliki character from these pilgrims. As time passed, the merchant classes converted to Islam and funded religious scholar groups. Religious schools, who practiced an Islamic form of private property, owned the land and claimed they also held power to deliver justice. This significantly delegitimized the role of the Funj kings and transferred power from the upper levels to the lower levels, to the clergy and merchant classes. Arabic slowly became the lingua franca of the empire, and the king began to claim Arab ancestry through the Umayyad dynasty to legitimize the king's hold on power. Religious scholars became more powerful, receiving protection from the king and positions on the king's council. A religious scholar's voice carried more weight in court than the statements of others, and they were actually exempt from taxation. The beating heart of the Funj Empire was a giant metropolis of trade, people, and politics, the city of Sennar, the jewel of the Blue Nile. The city was described in the mid-1600s as a large city on the Blue Nile, which is a tributary of the Nile, that had walls of 3 kilometers, with 3 large gates defended by 50 cannons, surrounded by suburbs. It was an absolute swarm of human activity and trade. There were dozens of mosques and religious buildings, hundreds of shops, as well as inns and coffee houses. There were massive marketplaces that sold goods from all over the world, as well as thousands and thousands of slaves. While we do not have exact population figures, in 1700, Theodor Crump, a Bavarian monk on pilgrimage to Ethiopia, visited the city and stated that after Cairo it was the largest city in Africa, rivaling any city in Anatolia, Arabia, and Persia. The life of the common people was similar to most places in the world at the time, poor, but in the Funj they were separated into 2 groups. You had sedentary farmers who lived along the Nile and fertile areas, growing crops, raising animals, and paying taxes. And you had nomadic groups who travelled along selected regions with large herds, trading with the settled peoples. The Funj Empire had no currency. The system was based on barter, with people using gold, textiles, animals, and other units of trade. Currency was actually used, but only as a form of barter. So for example, in the 1700s, the main form of barter in the Funj was actually the Spanish silver peso, which had absolutely flooded global markets in the 1700s with the Spanish mines in the New World. Taxes were placed on peasants' harvest. 1/10 of the total harvest was taxed. Taxes were also placed on water wheels and any land that was rained on. Peasants were required to provide unpaid construction and maintenance work for royal projects and provide part of their animal herd for transport. Weavers and craftsmen were required to provide part of their production as tax to the Funj state. Trade was the lifeblood of the Funj and was directly controlled by the king. The Funj king controlled the export of slaves, which provided huge amounts of income, and was responsible for dispatching royal caravans, technically the only legal way to trade within the Funj Empire. The Funj royalty held a monopoly on the trade of gold, slaves, firearm, cattle, ostrich feathers, and ivory coming in and out of the kingdom. Trade was extremely strict in the north, as they were trading with the Ottoman Empire so that they could collect proper tariffs, but it was more lax in the south, trading with the Ethiopians and the southern kingdoms and tribes. Imperial caravans were under the control of the Funj kings, but individual traders were allowed to accompany the caravans, but had to be registered as imperial agents. This meant that traders had to act first in the interest of the king. There was also a safety net though. If the goods were lost or stolen or destroyed, the king would pay for the loss. This gave the merchants an incentive to sign up with the trade caravan. It was a form of insurance. All trade into the Funj had to first go to Sennar, the only place outsiders could sell their wares in the Funj. Foreigners had to pay a fee to trade in the massive Sennar markets, as access was strictly regulated. As private ownership increased and the rise of wealthy merchants, the king's control of the royal monopoly absolutely collapsed and moved power further away from the central power of the king to the merchants and religious authorities. The Funj military was an extremely effective fighting force in the early years of the Funj Empire, but it failed to adapt to new technologies, such as gunpowder. The Funj army was based around heavy cavalry, which absolutely ripped through the light cavalry of the Arabs and light infantry and archers of the Nubians in the early years of the Funj. Heavily armed in mail and using large spears as lances, the Funj cavalry proved extremely powerful in the 15 and 1600s. Unfortunately, the Funj military failed to adapt to gunpowder and new modern tactics. Since gunpowder and firearms were under a royal monopoly, only the king was able to access them. This absolutely terrified the mechs and machs, as they had no access to modern tech and would be unable to protect themselves from the king or force the king to respect their autonomy and authority, which led to a series of revolts. The Funj was not a wheeled society, with animals hauling goods on their backs, and thus cannons became incredibly fixed defensive weapons. Most cannons in the Funj Empire were in Sennar, on the city walls. Eventually, the Funj military became outclassed by foreign powers and proved little threat and challenge to hostile forces. After decades of civil war and a failure to modernize its military, in 1821, a small Egyptian expedition was sent south by Muhammad Ali to conquer the Funj, and it succeeded without a shot being fired. The Egyptians entered Sennar, met with the last king of the Funj, Badi VII, and accepted his surrender, and the Funj was incorporated into the Egyptian Empire, then the Ottoman Empire, then the British Empire, and finally is today part of Sudan. You can go and visit Sennar today. It is a small town, but if you're there, stand back and have a think about how much power and wealth and prestige once flowed through this region. How important this city was in an entire continent habited by millions and millions of people, known worldwide for its fame, power, and prosperity.